Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webcast, The Convergence of Data Modeling and Data Governance. I'd like to start off by introducing two organizations who have been partnering for quite a while now, Sandhill Consultants and Access Software Designs. Sandhill Consultants are a consultancy organization that are here to help organizations design comprehensive data architectures founded on solid data management practices that can deliver trusted, consistent data, enabling an organization to reduce the risk and achieve compliance. Access Software Designs is a consulting and product development organization specializing in enterprise model management infrastructure. In partnering with Sandhill, Access delivers EM-SOS, a comprehensive metadata management framework based upon data management and data modeling best practices. I'd also like to introduce our speakers today. Our first speaker is Jeff Giles, Enterprise Architect from Sandhill. Jeff is a longtime enterprise architect and data governance expert who's been addressing the issues of the convergence of data modeling and data governance of the past several years. Our second speaker is Marcy Barkin-Goodwin. Marcy is founder and CEO of Access Software Designs since 1989. Access Software Designs has been providing education and consulting services to Fortune 1000 customers and for government entities for well over the past 20 years. Marcy is also co-creator of EM-SOS and is an expert in the field of enterprise model management infrastructure. Marcy's company Access is a valued partner of Sandhill, and together we offer EM-SOS, our metadata management framework, to our clients. You are, of course, listening to Robert Ludden, Vice President of Sandhill Consultants. In the upcoming presentation, we'll be highlighting how the requirements for data modeling are aligned with the goals of data governance. And it's certainly my hope that most folks in this call would agree that a data model management is the foundation to a strong data governance program. During this webcast, we will focus on an often critical and often ignored part of the puzzle, reuse. In a recent study that was publicized, we've seen that organizations out there tend to fail to reuse up to 70% of their metadata assets. And this is in part due to the failure of creating an infrastructure which facilitates the use of metadata and the consistent use of rules governing metadata standards. It's our hope through today's webcast that you'll see that we've got some solutions on how to address this. We'll also have a live Q&A at the end. And so with the introductions and topics covered, I'd like to ask Jeff Giles to kick off this session by reviewing the agenda for today's webcast. Jeff.
Thank you, Robert. Let's just take a look at some of the topics that we will cover for this webinar. Starting off, we'll talk a little bit about what is data governance, kind of like some definitions, so at least we level set what we're talking about when we talk about data governance. Then we'll talk about data modeling and its importance, and then we'll relate that to policies, standards, and procedures that relate to data modeling, and then take all of those and talk about how they relate to reusability as far as data structures and models. And then the whole concept of monitoring and measuring so that we can maintain quality. Then we'll take a look at guidelines and best practices, and then finally communication and accessibility for the models and the metadata. So let's start off just talking about what is data governance. Now there's lots of different definitions out there for data governance. I think I came across 5 or 6, but essentially they all have some similar characteristics. And one is that it's a set of processes. So it's work that you do. And in this case, it's related to data. And there's this concept of having some sort of formal management, not ad hoc, but actually formally accepted. And then that leads to some concept of things being trusted, and then once trusted, have people be accountable for that. So oftentimes you hear people talk about data as an asset, but data that you don't manage is not really an asset. It's actually kind of a liability in today's day and age. So it all depends on how you manage it. Now, if we take a look at metadata, just like data governance, also has a number of different definitions, but you know, there are some certain characteristics that are similar. So metadata is a description. It provides some context, it provides structure, it provides classification, and then ultimately all of that stuff really just adds meaning to data which of course makes it easier to find, easier to use, and easier to trace. So metadata is the key to managing data and information assets. So modeling kind of brings these things together. So if you think about it, data models are really, you can have one or more. You can have a collection of models that document the integration of your business requirements and the data within the organization. So if we look at this, we can look at this from the top to the bottom and from the bottom to the top. So top to the bottom, we're talking about driving a business objective. So business wants to meet certain objectives. Maybe it's within the next year or next 5 years, but they have a set of objectives they want to meet. The discovery of metadata is a lot like the reverse engineering that you do in data modeling. You can point your data modeling tool to the database and discover what kind of metadata actually exists in there. And then from that, you can build the models, and the models begin to provide the context for the data that is actually being described there. So when we look at this, what we're really doing is creating blueprints for data. So if you think about it, data modeling is one of the primary means to identify, describe, provide some sort of structure and classification for your data assets. So in looking at this, data modeling itself is a pretty important part of data management, but you'd never know this by listening to the current trends today in data management. Unfortunately, data modeling doesn't get a lot of headlines these days, but it's still a very important practice. So if we look at this, on the left-hand side, we've got the data management body of knowledge, also known as the DMBOK. And you can see in the DMBOK wheel, data governance is right in the middle. It takes prominence for everything. And then, you know, the spokes coming off that hub, we've got data modeling, data architecture, metadata management. All of these things are actually modeling practices. And on the right-hand side, we have the DMM, or Data Management Maturity Model. And in the middle of this, we can see that data modeling is in here, and it actually ties to things like glossaries, metadata management, the data integration, architectural standards. So data modeling plays a central part here as well. So these two areas actually show us that we have to have some sort of idea between how we can take our data governance concepts and apply them to a data modeling practice. Oftentimes when I go and talk to folks, they approach their data modeling like a project. They say, okay, we're building a new database, a new data warehouse. Let's build a data model so that we can build the data warehouse. But they just use it as sort of a project deliverable. Once they've done it, they don't use it again, which is rather unfortunate because they did a lot of work to build out that data model. Now, when you talk about data governance and you read certain data governance books out there, they all say the same thing. You need to take your data governance practices and you need to integrate them with your technology and your IT practices. But that's where it stops. They don't actually go any further than that except to say, yeah, you should integrate these things. So we're left with this problem. How do we convert what we're supposed to do in the governance to how we actually do it in data modeling? So if we look here, we said data governance. We've got policies, standards, procedures, measures, roles, and responsibilities. Those are all governance characteristics. Then we've got data modeling tools. We've got models, data objects, metadata, and then we've got this best practices idea around how these guidelines all intersect. So in the graphic on the right-hand side here, our goal is to get to some sort of standards and procedures around how we do modeling that will allow us to actually approach it more as a program or practice and less as a project with a project deliverable. So that's really what we're going to talk about for the remainder of this. So this diagram here is more like a small flow chart that essentially talks about this integration of governance and modeling. If you look across the top here, we've got some blue boxes. Those are pretty standard ways that you look at governance. And then the boxes below it are essentially how those boxes relate back to data modeling. So starting on the left-hand side, you've got to start with your governance policies. So whatever the business wants to do, that actually becomes a policy. And then from a modeling perspective, that defines the guides for your modeling requirements. That is, what kind of data needs to be collected and managed. The procedure part in modeling is to provide some sort of consistent, reliable steps to accomplishing your modeling activities. Less of a sort of a chaotic approach to let's just build a model, but let's build a model in a structured, repeatable format. Then that is related back to standards, and standards are how we actually govern the metadata quality and reliability. And then that's related to the metadata. So when we apply that to the metadata, we're starting to build something that we can reuse, something that's trustable. And then finally, you've got to monitor it for change, right? Because none of this stuff is static. It's always being changed as the business changes and the rules change and the policies change. So therefore, we have to continue to monitor this. So these are the things we're going to look at in the next few slides. And we'll start off with the governance policies. So data governance policies guide the procedures. So let's take a look at that. This is really the transformation of policy to procedure. And a procedure represents nothing more than work that we have to do. So in modeling, work that we have to do is, how do I make a model? Who's responsible for checking that model to make sure it's a good model? What data objects should we include in the model? What data objects do we not include in the model? So these are the procedures that we want to be able to do in a reliable, predictable way. So we need to enable the enforcement of the governance policies through our modeling practices. These practices work through the entire life cycle of the model. So from conceptual to logical to physical to implementation. And then, of course, establishing responsibility and stewardship. And we know that these are two critical components to data governance. So although we as modelers define maybe what the data structures are in the metadata, we do need the stewards to help us define what the definition of it is. So we need to start to look at establishing responsibility between the business side as well as the IT side, that's that integration. But of course, once we do this, then we can provide an audit trail or traceability to this metadata that we're creating. Now, procedures are fairly evolutionary. That is, you'll probably build some procedures around how you want to do data modeling, and they might not be right the first time you do them. You might have to go back and reiterate through it again and modify it and tweak it until you get the procedure just right. But if you keep at it, then you will eventually get to a set of predictable and reliable steps around how you build and manage your models. Now, all of this adds up to this idea that you can reduce training for new resources. So a lot of the times when I go in and talk to organizations, one of the questions they have is that every time we bring a new guy into the organization, we don't know how to bring them up to speed because everybody here does things a different way. I can have this person sit with Jeff for a couple hours on one week, and maybe Robert another week, and somebody else yet another week. And all three people will probably tell this new hire something different about how they actually do it. So there's nothing consistent about that. So what happens is the person takes a long time to ramp up. So one of the byproducts of all of this procedural stuff is that we can now reduce the training it takes for a new data architect, a new data modeler, or somebody doing some kind of data modeling. So then that comes to the model and metadata quality standards. So when we build data models, we obviously are making data objects, but more than that, we're actually beginning to define what kinds of diagrams are we going to have in this data model? What's the name of this data model? So what we're doing is we're establishing some metadata consistency. And by metadata consistency, we're talking about names for data and data models as well, standard abbreviations and acronyms, definitions, diagramming graphics. I mean, how many times have you gone into an organization and one group is using IE notation and another group is using Barker notation and another group is using IDEF1X? If we don't have any consistency around how we're going to do the modeling, it's going to be very difficult to present those models, which are really just information assets, to people in the business, people in other IT organizations, stakeholders, etc. So we need to have some consistency for that. But once we've established the consistency, now we can start to measure a quality level, because we can say that these things need to be in place for a good quality model, a good quality data object. Now, a lot of this stuff can be enforced through data modeling tool functionality. I mean, the three tools that I'm most familiar with are Power Designer, Irwin, and ER Studio. I'm sure there's probably some other tools out there that I'm not familiar with, but those are the big three that I know about. And I know that those three do have some mechanisms in place for enforcing some naming standards, some abbreviations. There are some model consistency checks that'll check for definitions, etc. And you can leverage these to help you with these standards, which will in turn save you time in the model checking later on. So of course, once we've standardized an object, then we can now reuse it. So the whole thing about a standard object means that it's already gone through the quality control process. So when we want to use it, we don't have to fear that maybe this is not a correct object, or maybe there's something wrong with this object. I mean, how many times have you worked on a project where somebody said, oh, we don't have a product entity. Oh, go dig up an old model that has a product entity in it. Let's go copy that and we'll paste it into this new model and we'll start to build out this new model, and that'll probably save us some time. But you have no idea whether that's an old product reference, or is it missing something, or are there attributes in it that are no longer relevant, or any other thing. So the idea here is that if you go through this validation process, you produce a trustworthy, standardized data structure. And that in turn allows you to build out some critical data elements, master data objects, because the idea here is that we don't need to standardize everything under the sun, but there are certain elements that we use and reuse a lot in the data models that we build. It makes sense to basically approve them for reuse. So of course, this makes you a lot more agile. I mean, how many times have you heard people say, oh my God, do we have to work with the data guys? Every time we work with the data guys, they slow us down. They are so not agile. Well, this is one way to improve your agility. I can say, okay, well, we've defined a lot of these critical data elements already. Let's go get them and stick them in the model for the next project. But as you use them, then you may find that they need to be modified and maybe revalidated and brought back up as a modified data object. So you need to have processes to ensure that the quality's there, but it does save you time, which in turn saves you money, and it also saves you some effort. You can put things up there as abstract as, let's say, something like a data model pattern. There are lots of data model patterns out there that might have to do with, let's say, a status of something, or classification, or contact mechanisms. A lot of these things are already pre-built, and you can reuse them, provided they're good quality objects, and build out your model. So here's an example of a reuse report. Now, a lot of times people will say, well, how do we know that we're getting some sort of return on this investment and all this model stuff you're talking about, Jeff? I mean, we can set up policies, we can set up standards, we can do all this stuff, but I don't know if we're getting any closer to the goal or not. So what is the return on investment? But it's not really return on investment, because it's hard to do a measure of that. But what you can do is you can say, well, let's measure the reuse of something. Now, when you first start your data modeling practice or program, you probably aren't going to have that many reusable objects, because you kind of have to start from scratch. However, over time, you'll build more objects, you'll reuse more objects, and then if you look at this pie chart over here on the right, you could say, well, look, almost half of the objects that we're using in our new models are actually standard reusable data objects. This saved us a lot of time. You may find non-standard objects that may need to go through a vetting process to become standard objects, and you might have a bunch of objects that may actually be good candidates to become standard data objects. But you can measure this kind of stuff. And when you do this, what you're really doing is you're elevating your maturity level. You're going from data model project chaos, where everybody does their own thing their own way for their own projects, to having some consistency, which might take us to a modeling maturity level of 2 or 3 in the DMM. And of course, increased consistency means it's trustable, because when somebody looks at that, they say, that's exactly the same object that appeared in another model that had the same, let's say, reference to customer or something like that, which in turn provides increased traceability because we know where it came from. It came from that same reservoir of reusable data objects. So in essence, what you get, the higher degree of reuse is really equivalent to a higher degree of data governance, or in this case, metadata governance. But of course, none of this stuff is static. At times, stuff changes, it becomes modified. And if you don't manage it, what will happen is it will just start to decay over time. I mean, the key to this whole stuff here is being able to monitor and manage how things change over time. Because a lot of times people will just sort of say, well, we got the practice in place, we're good, all right. And then over time, that object that was a standard object now is less standard because it doesn't really represent what is really true. You know, if enough time passes, then you're just going to be back to square one where you originally started at DMM level 1. So of all the processes, this one here is the most important part. So you've got to be able to manage, once a data object is created, how that object changes over time. And of course, all of this stuff relates back to guidelines and best practices. So guidelines and best practices are really the agreement amongst everybody on how we're going to do the work that we need to do for data modeling. That's what it really comes down to. So here you can look at the way that we're going to handle the data model lifecycle. Are we going to go conceptual, logical, physical? How are we going to do that? Metadata model standards, glossaries, and data dictionaries. I mean, a lot of what you do does require some sort of definition around the object you create, but oftentimes people don't really know what a good definition is. I mean, everybody's seen the customer ID is the ID of the customer, which is probably one of the worst kinds of definitions you can have. So there should be some standards, some guidelines on exactly what makes a good definition, what makes a good abbreviation. A lot of times people tell me that they create abbreviations, but they don't necessarily know how to take 3 or 4 words and abbreviate them down into something that you can reuse. So there should be some guidelines around how you do that kind of stuff. So those are the model artifacts that you'll build. And of course, the procedures, once we have a defined set of procedures, we can control how things get created, how they're validated, how change control happens, who's the steward, how do we promote this data object to become a reusable data object? What if we have conflict? What's the standard way that we approach conflict? So these become your guidelines and best practices for your modeling practice. And then of course, finally, once we've gone through all this effort to develop the standards, develop the procedures, develop all the things that we need for our data modeling practice, we can't really keep them to ourselves. We have to communicate them. We have got to publish them so that other people can see what we're doing and make use of the artifacts that we're building. Things like maybe a business glossary comes from this. Maybe there's a data dictionary that's published. A lot of this stuff that we actually standardize should be out there for other people to use. And there's lots of different communication mechanisms out there. There, you know, the standard web-based company intranet website that's out there, but it could be a Word document, it could be Microsoft Excel, could be Word, could be a PDF document. There's collaboration software out there like SharePoint, Wiki. I think I've heard of Confluence, Documentum, some of the other ones that are out there. Leverage this software to its greatest extent so that you can publish all the information you know, that you've collected and built. Now, everything that I've talked to up to this point is in generalities for what you need for a good data modeling practice. At this point, I'd like to introduce Marcy Barkin-Goodwin to talk about a product that she's co-developed with Sandhill called EM-SOS that takes a lot of the concepts that I've just discussed and applies them in a product context. So, Marcy, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jeff. Hi, everyone. We just wanted to give you an idea of what this product, EM-SOS, is. Go to the next screen, please. So we're just going to show you a couple of screenshots to give you an idea. I think that, you know, let me level set here and say that most of us know that data governance and metadata management is important. But the challenge has always been that folks don't have the time or necessarily the expertise to write a lot of standards and procedures and so forth. So when we created EM-SOS, our idea was really very simple. All of us come from a modeling background, data architecture background, and so forth. And the key to this is please make this as easy as possible. Have it be efficient, have it be easy. I don't want a million standards and procedures that are difficult or convoluted to follow and so forth. So that was what our goal was here, was to not only make it easy, but to have all of the content in one place and to provide a framework that essentially lays everything out so that the modeler, the business analyst, the DBA, all those people who need to access this type of information can very easily find what they need, know what they have to do, and be able to be efficient about it. So EM-SOS provides all these different things that Jeff has been talking about. It establishes a data model lifecycle, or several of them. We may go from conceptual down to physical. We may do some re-engineering or whatever. The importance of the life cycle, however, is that we want folks to do it consistently. And we also want those models to be able to adhere to what we are trying to do in the way of data governance. So we start with a data model life cycle. We have our standards. We have repeatable processes, so we know what folks are doing and that it's consistent. We know where they are in the process. Of course, we want to build a library, if you will, of reusable data structures. This is really at the heart of meeting data governance requirements, because we know that the structures that are standardized, we can use them and be assured of the fact that they will be reliable and trustworthy, that we're all using the same thing. We need to be able to look at this and see what the metrics are. Are we getting better with this? What is the degree of reuse and so forth? And we need to be able to communicate. Jeff, next slide, please. Great. So this is just a high-level view. We just want to give you an idea. You're looking at EM-SOS, but you'll notice that on the left is an index. So the entire tool is based simply on the index on the left. So you're going to click on whatever you need on the left, and then you'll see the information on the right. It's very easy to follow. It's very easy to read and so forth. At the top, you'll see a section for the data model lifecycle. And we just happen to be looking at the high-level diagram that we provide. But there are many more diagrams below this, as you can see, in terms of showing from a diagram point of view. A picture is worth 1,000 words, which is why we do data modeling to begin with. It makes understanding much easier before we have to read many pages of text. So what we've done is created a lot of different diagrams that talk about the different processes and so forth, whether we're doing agile or waterfall, whatever. What is the life cycle so we can bring data management into it? So what this diagram represents is a high-level view, but with all of these arrows between the different objects, they all represent a different process for how we get there. And the process will be in the index on the left. So we have the DMLC, and then below that we have a standard section, as you can see, and then below that there are procedures. Okay, Jeff, we can go to the next one. The importance of this is that EM-SOS was written so that everything is cross-referenced. In other words, our strategy here is to bring in the requirements of data governance and the ability to build our percentage of reuse. So every standard, every procedure is written with those goals in mind. We're just showing you here, this is, as you can see, a logical data object. This would be a standard for an attribute. The only thing I want to say about this is that if you look at the standard section on the right side, you'll see all these different bullets, initial case, singular noun, and so forth. We understand that different organizations, of course, have different standards. So, but the reason that we have delineated all of these bullets is to say you need to document this. These are things that must be in your documentation for your standards. So if your attribute is all uppercase, then you change this. We're giving you a framework that is enormously robust in terms of what we have written in here, but it's, of course, customizable for your particular organization. We just want to save you all the work of trying to figure out what you need and taking all the time to document that. So this is really a very robust jumpstart, if you will, for what you need to have. So that's kind of what I wanted to point out here. Okay, Jeff? Great. Here's a process. In this case, we're looking at model creation and population. If you look on the left in the index, you'll see that that's what's highlighted. All of the other processes are here. I would like to say just for a moment that what we happen to be looking at in this webinar is the Irwin version of EM-SOS. So we have things like library naming and so forth. However, for instance, in the Power Designer version, you would see something like how do we name folders and so forth. So the product has been written to accommodate whatever data modeling tool you're using, because all standards and procedures and so forth, they're necessary no matter what tool you're using. But we wanted to make it easy and wanted to give you, you know, a time-effective way of having this be personal in terms of whatever tool you're using. I will point out also that on some of this in the purpose statement, for instance, you will see that we have a light blue, if you can see that, there are certain phrases and so forth. These are hyperlinks, and these hyperlinks will bring you to other things that are in the index. They can also bring you out to spreadsheets that you have, Word documents that you have, PDFs and so forth. So EM-SOS is capable of linking out to existing artifacts that you already have. The idea here is to give you one place from which you can access everything. I'm also going to tell you about the template. Jeff, if you'll give me the overlay, please. Every standard and procedure in EM-SOS has followed a template. We believe in standards, and so we had to come up with a template that would make it easy for folks to find things. So we have a purpose statement at the top. That helps with the educational aspect of this when we have junior folks in. We tell them why you need the standard and procedure. We have a responsibility section, so you know who to go to if you have a question about something, and also who has the authority to change it. The description will be the standard or the procedure itself. The tips section is our blood, sweat, and tears in terms of things that we've learned either about the tool that will help you, or the procedure, or a particular issue that you might run into, and our suggestions for how to solve all of that. This bottom last section, the revision history, is very important. All of our financial and health-related clients have a tremendous need for an audit trail. They get audited quite a bit. And in this revision history section, it allows us to show when the metadata has changed and why. So you'll have who changed it, what the date was, why it was changed, and so forth. So this is something that has become extremely valuable to folks. So we just wanted to show you the template. You have an idea now how all of the standards and procedures are written. Okie dokie. Next one. Great. Reusable data structures. You're looking at data object promotion. This is the process for how we vet an object to make it a shared object, to make it reusable. This is really the heart of our data governance requirement. We want to standardize more and more as we go. As Jeff mentioned in the beginning, your library will be fairly small. You'll start probably with your super entities, you know, customer, product, employee, whatever. The idea here is that we can then trust the definitions, the formats, the data types, so forth and so on. But that doesn't mean that everybody uses that particular object in exactly the same way. You may only need several of those attributes, or you may find that you need to add a few attributes that aren't there. The process allows, of course, for all of that, and that is the change that Jeff mentioned before, how we manage the change of our metadata. Once you decide that, for instance, you need to add an attribute, it will go through a process of being vetted. It may be something that is only required for that local model, that local application, whatever, and we decide, no, we don't need to bring that attribute into the shared object, but of course you can use it. Or it might be something where we say, we forgot that. This is something that many models can use, let's add it in. And then there's a process for notifying folks to say, hey, this global object changed. We've added this attribute. See if you need it. If you do, take it in. If not, no worries, but it's there. So this is data object promotion. Jeff, if I could have the overlay. Great. I just wanted to show you that this is one of the diagrams in the DMLC that I mentioned. And the heart of this, of course, is to show how we vet a global shared object. Is it a candidate? Is it local? And so forth. Again, these pictures give you the high-level view of what this process is, and then the documented process gives you all of the specifics. Okay, Jeff. Great. Special reports. Let's have the overlay, Jeff. This is one of the reports that comes with EM-SOS. We happen to be looking at the logical physical data objects, and we talk about entities and tables here. And basically all it's saying is, I've run this report on this particular model, and it's going to show me the percentage of entities and attributes that have definitions or don't. It will show me my percentage of reuse. And this is a great report, if I say so myself, because the developer, the modeler, can use this report during their own development to see where they are in the model, right? They can run this at any point in time. Are they using a standard template and so forth? And they can use this to help them see what may be missing in their model and so forth without going through every single object. But it's also a great report for showing management the progress that we're making because our percentage of reuse is going up. Every time I see that percentage point move up, it means that I'm saving time and effort and that my standardization is causing us to have more governance around our data. So we just wanted to give you an idea that this is one of the reports in here that really helps us in development as well as status in terms of where we are. Okay, Jeff. Great. One last slide. This is the last one to show you a bit of EM-SOS. This is a workflow. You're looking at the SharePoint version. EM-SOS also comes in strict HTML. But the SharePoint version allows us to build these workflows for the processes. And I just wanted to give you an idea that what's so very important, you know, every organization has some standards, they have some procedures, they have some documentation or whatever. But typically what we see when we go in to help folks is that they may have a siloed environment, there may be different sets of standards, there's a lack of communication, and a lot of companies, even large companies that we go into, almost have a kind of, I call it a mom and pop approach to data modeling, where folks are doing different things, copying and pasting, as Jeff said, from previous models that may or may not actually still be correct. What's important is to have a central location where we can look at all of this stuff and say, this is all enterprise stuff. All of this belongs to the enterprise itself, to the whole company, not just to one business area. We need to make that easy for folks to bring all of that stuff together and to be able to see it all in one place. These workflows not only show you the status of the model, which you can see across the top. I've submitted this model, you see who submitted it and so forth. It goes through a technical review, approval, and then it gets published, whatever. And of course, these can be customized. But let's say that that's our basic flow. So we see the status of where that model is. Great. But in addition to that, you'll see that we have a document section, and you can link out then to related documents or artifacts that you already have that are in your spreadsheets or whatever, and that you can bring them in so that everybody can see them. They don't have to go out and figure out where they are. They can just link to them and say, ah, okay, I see this here. The same holds true for the discussions. Here is a place where we can say, you know, you submitted the model, we're fine with it except for this one particular thing. They can discuss it here. They can figure out what they want to do. And so it makes the complication of approvals and models and everything else much, much easier and faster to deal with, because you're all coming into one place to see all of this. You know, I just want to say, I'm going to hand this over to Robert in just a second, but I just would like to finish up by saying that because all of us have a background in all of these practices, the most important thing to us was to build a tool that made the modelers' life easier. And that's basically between the ease of use, the amount of content that is in here, and the fact that it's all written around establishing the data governance goals for all of our metadata. That was what we strive to do. And personally, I think we've done a great job. Robert, I'm going to hand this over to you now. Jeff, you can proceed on the next slide.
Thanks, Marcy, and thanks, Jeff. So I was sort of busily typing in answers to questions as best I could. So when we go into Q&A in a couple of minutes, maybe we can review some of those questions for the larger audience, because I think one of them, we're still kind of a question is outstanding that we'll need Jeff to address. But anyway, as we begin to wrap up our webcast, many of you may be wondering, and in fact, we've actually had some people ask us how they can validate are on their journey of the convergence of data modeling and data governance. And Sandhill would always recommend performing an assessment. This assessment allows us to evaluate where you are. It allows us to evaluate, first of all, the modeling technologies which you're using, because one of the things that a question was asked was, would this apply to the IBM's data architecture tool sets or other tool sets? And yes, this can be applied to any modeling solution out there. We just mentioned the three most popular because that's the ones we often come across. but it doesn't restrict us to those 3 modeling technologies. The second thing we want to then look at is obviously in-house resources, because an organization, and what we're saying here, this isn't rocket science, but usually, and Marcy mentions at the beginning, a lot of people don't have the in-house resources available to do what they need to do, and of course they then get behind the 8 ball. Another question that comes up, and something that we do in our assessment, is that most organizations, and Marcy mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, most organizations without fail have some standards, have some procedures. The problem is that they're not usually in a centralized repository. They're not usually integrated with a tool set. They're not usually the first go-to location that an organization would go to and say, hey, I've got a complete audit trail of all my standards, procedures, and workflow, and this is how it all works, right? So we would look at the organization's existing materials, because there may be some great stuff in there that they're just not leveraging properly. And the third thing that we'd also look at is determining the strategy. And by that, I mean, do you build your metadata management framework yourself, or do you buy a metadata management framework such as the one that we're proposing? You'll find that there's only the buy option is the EM-SOS, or you're actually building it. And a lot of organizations have built it, but the problem is that they built it quite a while ago. It's not fully integrated. It's not easy to access. It's in spreadsheets. It's in Word documents. It's all over the place. And so obviously there's a need to review where they're at and how they address this, especially if they want to merge this convergence of data modeling and data governance. Jeff, can you go to the next slide? So just a quick slide showing the organizations that we've been helping on this journey. And obviously, if your organization is interested in having a discussion around how you can achieve the integration of quality data governance with critical data modeling practices, then obviously you'd want to give us a call. And Jeff, if you go to the next slide, what we'll do is we'll go into Q&A because there are some questions that had come up. So obviously, my name is Robert Lutton. My email address is here. You can contact me for any follow-up questions that we don't get answered today. Please use the chat box to address some of your questions in there, and we will try and get to as many questions as we can during this next 5-7 minute section. So Jeff, I'm going to start with one of the questions that was outstanding that I tried to address, but we need to really talk a little bit more about that. The question is in regards to what best practices do you have for the approach of a development methodology, an agile development methodology? So can you address how we can actually look at an agile methodology from a best practices, data modeling, data governance perspective?
Well, from a data modeling perspective, as far as agile, so that's really just an iterative approach, is kind of outlined in this reusable object concept. So it's really being able to say, okay, we have a data object that we've defined. We've defined it because it's critical. That is, we use it in lots of different places, and without it, we can't run the business. So that object becomes, a fully validated and verified object that I can use. Now, often people tell me something like, well, we need a 360-degree view of customer, let's say, for instance. So what ends up happening is your reusable data object basically has all of the characteristics that one would need to know about a customer, and that you would basically remove, let's say, attributes that didn't apply to that particular project. Like, let's say, for instance, it was customer within the context of sales, or it was customer within the context of invoicing, or it was customer within the context of marketing. You may need more or less attributes or columns for that particular object, but the idea is that because it's a reusable object and contains all the characteristics, I can quickly get rid of the ones that I don't need. And of course, there are instances where you're going to add some additional characteristics that might be relevant for this particular project. Then you might submit that, as Marcy said, through some sort of process that says, okay, this is a candidate that we might want to elevate up to a reusable status. So then it would go through the vetting process business would chime in on it, IT would chime in on it, and then it would become a reusable object. That's kind of like the agile approach to data modeling. Now, another way of looking at it is, how do I get my data architecture team on agile teams to work as part of an application development process? And I'm asked that question from time to time as well. And usually what you do is you embed somebody from the data architecture team, or maybe a liaison who you've sort of deputized to be on that team, and they start to help understand what the requirements are going to be. And then that helps you understand what kind of data objects you need to make, which ones you have, which ones you might need to develop. I did read an interesting book by a fellow named John Giles, no relation to me, but it's called The Nimble Elephant, and it talks about pattern-based reusable objects and data structures for high level of abstractions, like things like a status level, which is really more of a, what kind of events happen that changes the status of an object through its evolution. And that's an interesting book, and those concepts can easily be applied to the data governance and EM-SOS stuff that we've talked about as well. So I hope that answers the question. If it doesn't, let us know, and we'll follow up.
Thanks, Jeff. We had another question that came up. Unfortunately, this client is actually using Excel, and he's indicating that it's currently a painful process, which a lot of our clients are using Excel and Word to store some of their standards. And he said, don't even mention procedures because it's left at the end of the project. But Marcy, how would we address the question of, I have some in-house standards and limited procedures, but how would that work with EM-SOS?
Good question. We completely and utterly respect and start with whatever standards and or procedures that you already have. As I mentioned, everybody we go into has at least the basic stuff. So if that's working for you, then that's wonderful. And all we do is we bring the existing standards and procedures into EM-SOS. Let me clarify. Everything that we have written, all of this robust content that we have, we're not, it's not a methodology. We are not telling you what standards you should have. Everybody has something different, and if it works for them, the only thing we care about is that it's consistent within the organization. So that's why we've made EM-SOS easily customizable, because we want to bring in the stuff that you already have, and then be able to add on standards and or procedures that you may not already have, that you haven't figured out yet, or things that you may have a standard, but you're missing certain properties that need to be documented, that type of thing. This is where the assessment of the existing materials comes in. We can help you say, okay, this is what you have, this is what's missing. We may be able to improve this process that you're doing, because later you might run into problems with X, Y, and Z. What do you think about doing it this way? So it's a very interactive process, and EM-SOS is not only meant to be customized to include your own stuff, but it's meant to evolve over time. This is not a static product. We wanted to give you a framework where, as things change within your environment, you could bring them into EM-SOS and change things. So all of our customers work with EM-SOS on a daily basis in terms of changing something or notifying somebody, excuse me, of a change or whatever it might be. So we always start with your existing standards and procedures, and then uplift them, if you will, into this framework so that everyone has access to them, and then we fill in the blanks for you. So we are not telling you that the methodology that we have written here is anything that you should follow. It's just a guideline to say, if this particular thing isn't right for you, you need to rewrite this, excuse me, and change this to have it be something that works for you.
Excellent. Thanks, Marcy. Jeff, just one last question we received is that if we don't have your content management system such as SharePoint, does your product work with any other content management systems?
Yeah, so in the communication side of things, obviously what Marcy showed was all written on top of SharePoint, and SharePoint's pretty prevalent in a lot of organizations. However, I have talked to people that have, I think I mentioned Confluence was one, Documentum was yet another one. There's lots of different contact management or content management, I guess I should say, solutions out there. We can work with you to retrofit a lot of the content that we have for whatever system you want to use, whatever organizational standard you might have about communication, to make it work with those systems as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeff. So with that, we're heading up almost at the hour here. I'd like to thank everyone for their comments and questions. Hopefully we addressed them all. There's a couple that we'll do a follow-up email. So we'd like to thank everyone for their time. And as I say, we have recorded this webcast. So what we'll do is we will post it to our YouTube channel, and we'll also send out a follow-up email to everyone, letting them know that this is now available, and hopefully they can share it with their colleagues. And any kind of questions, please come back to me on the email here, and we would be delighted to have a conversation with you. Thanks, everyone.